My name is Nettie, and I'm 58 years old. All my life, I've been the kind of mother who puts her child first no matter what. That's why I spent weeks organizing my son Jackson's 25th birthday celebration. I helped pay for the party, picked out his favorite restaurant, and even baked his favorite cake from scratch. But when I arrived at the celebration, something happened that changed everything. When I looked over at the head table, I noticed the seat next to him was saved for his stepmom. Even the family dog had a spot. Before I tell you how I went from background character to the star of my own life, let me know where you're watching from and subscribe if you've ever felt invisible in your own family. I grew up in a small town in Minnesota, always the shy, artistic girl who preferred watercolors to conversation. My parents encouraged my creativity, though they worried about how I'd make my way in a world that seemed to reward the bold and outspoken. I was content in my quiet corner until I met Thomas during my sophomore year of college. Thomas was everything I wasn't. Confident, ambitious, with a booming laugh that filled every room he entered. He was studying finance while I pursued art education, and we met in the campus coffee shop when he accidentally knocked over my sketchbook. Instead of a quick apology, he sat down and asked about my drawings. No one had ever shown such genuine interest in my art before. "You see the world differently," he told me. "It's beautiful." Our romance was a whirlwind. Within 6 months, we were inseparable. Thomas made me feel special in ways I'd never experienced. He pulled me out of my shell, introduced me to his wide circle of friends, and convinced me that together we could build an amazing life. I was 22 when he proposed, with a modest diamond ring in the same coffee shop where we'd met. "We're going to conquer the world, Nettie," he promised. "You and me." The early years of our marriage were happy ones. We moved into a small apartment decorated with my paintings and his business school awards. Thomas landed a position at a prestigious financial firm, and I began teaching art at an elementary school. We were young in love and full of dreams, but as Thomas's career accelerated, our life began shifting to accommodate his ambitions. First came a move to Chicago for a better position. I left my teaching job behind, assuring myself it was temporary. Then another move to Denver and finally to Seattle. Each time, Thomas's salary increased, and each time I started over trying to find my footing. "It's just for now," Thomas would say. "Once I'm established, you can focus on your career again." But just for now stretched into years. I took substitute teaching positions, worked at galleries, anything to keep my hand in the art world, but nothing stuck. Gradually, I became the supporter rather than the partner. I organized our social calendar, maintained our home, and cheered Thomas's successes from the sidelines. When I turned 33, Jackson came into our lives. From the moment they placed him in my arms, a tiny bundle with Thomas's dark eyes and my wavy hair, I was completely in love. Motherhood gave me a purpose I'd been missing, and I threw myself into it wholeheartedly. By then, Thomas was rarely home. Business trips, late meetings, weekend conferences, his absence became our normal. When he was home, he was distracted, always checking emails or taking calls. The little boy who needed bedtime stories and skinned knee kisses became my domain entirely. "You're so good with him," Thomas would say, patting my shoulder as he passed through the kitchen on his way to his home office. "He's lucky to have you." It was meant as a compliment, but looking back, it was the beginning of my invisibility. I became the background of our family portrait, essential for the composition, but not the focus. I began to fade further into the wallpaper of our increasingly luxurious homes, making everything run smoothly while drawing less and less attention to my own needs or dreams. Jackson became my world. I channeled all my creative energy into being his mother, designing elaborate birthday parties, creating Halloween costumes from scratch, volunteering at his school. If Thomas noticed my disappearing act, he never mentioned it. He was too busy climbing the corporate ladder, bringing home larger bonuses and more impressive titles. I told myself it was enough, that the sparkle in Jackson's eyes when I picked him up from school made up for the growing distance between Thomas and me. That being a good mother was more important than being a fulfilled woman. That fading into the background was a noble sacrifice rather than a slow erasure of self. But deep down, I was beginning to wonder who Nettie was beyond being Jackson's mother and Thomas's wife. The young woman with the sketchbook seemed like someone I'd known in another life. The day I found out about Thomas's affair with Stephanie was ordinary in every way until it wasn't. Jackson was 8 years old in third grade, obsessed with dinosaurs and soccer. I was planning his upcoming birthday party, scrolling through Thomas's emails on our shared computer, looking for confirmation that he'd be in town for the celebration. Instead, I found dozens of messages between him and Stephanie, his glamorous coworker with the corner office. Messages filled with intimate details, plans for their future complaints about his stifling home life. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. The life I'd poured myself into for over a decade was apparently a prison my husband was desperate to escape. When confronted, Thomas didn't deny it. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. "I've wanted to tell you for months," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Stephanie and it's real, Nettie. I want a divorce." The next few months were a blur of lawyer meetings, property divisions, and trying to explain to Jackson why Daddy wasn't living at home anymore. Thomas was generous with financial support, but ruthless about custody arrangements. He wanted weekend visitation holidays and half the summer. His lawyer painted him as an involved father, conveniently forgetting the years of missed soccer games and parent-teacher conferences. "It's better this way," Thomas insisted. "Jackson needs both of us in his life." 6 months after moving out, Thomas introduced Jackson to Stephanie. A month later, they were engaged. By the time the divorce was finalized, they had purchased a sprawling house in the most expensive neighborhood in Seattle. Meanwhile, I downsized to a modest 3-bedroom in a good school district, stretching my newly acquired alimony and child support to make it work. I had to find a job quickly. My teaching credentials had lapsed years ago, and the job market wasn't kind to a woman in her 40s with a spotty employment history. I eventually secured a position as an administrative assistant at an elementary school. The irony wasn't lost on me. Instead of teaching art as I'd planned, I was filing paperwork and answering phones. But it allowed me to be home when Jackson got out of school, and that was what mattered most. Thomas's career continued its meteoric rise, unhindered by the family upheaval. If anything, with Stephanie by his side, he seemed more successful than ever. She was everything I wasn't: assertive, professionally accomplished, socially connected. She wore designer clothes and drove a luxury car. Their life together looked like a magazine spread. Jackson noticed. How could he not? Weekends with his father meant trips to amusement parks, sporting events, and fancy restaurants. Weekends with me were movie nights at home, visits to the free museum, and bike rides around the neighborhood. I tried to tell myself that what mattered was quality time, not expensive experiences, but I saw the way Jackson's eyes lit up when describing his adventures with Thomas and Stephanie. Stephanie was calculated in her approach to winning Jackson over. She never tried to replace me outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she positioned herself as the fun, cool adult in his life, the one who always said yes, the one who slipped him extra dessert and bought him video games I deemed too violent, the one who whispered, "Don't tell your mom," establishing their special bond of secrets. I tried not to be jealous. I told myself that having another adult who cared about Jackson was a good thing, but each time he came home bubbling with stories about Steph and the amazing things she'd done, a little piece of my heart crumbled. I countered with what I could offer: consistency, understanding, and true maternal love. I was the one who stayed up all night when he had the flu. I was the one who helped with homework and taught him to cook. I was the one who knew that he slept with his window cracked even in winter, and that he was secretly afraid of elevators. But against the backdrop of Thomas and Stephanie's glamorous life, my quiet devotion seemed increasingly mundane. I began to feel like I was competing in a game I couldn't win, with rules that changed every time I thought I was catching up. "Mom," Jackson said once after returning from a weekend with them, "why don't we ever go to restaurants like Dad and Steph? They took me to this place where they cook right at your table." I smiled and swallowed the hurt. "We could go sometime for a special occasion." I offered, mentally calculating how many hours of overtime I'd need to work to afford it. He shrugged. "It's okay. I was just wondering." But I knew it wasn't just wondering. It was comparing. And in the comparison, I was beginning to lose ground. As Jackson entered his teenage years, I watched with a mixture of pride and concern as he began to mirror his father's values and priorities. The sweet, sensitive boy who once brought me wildflowers from the playground was evolving into a young man preoccupied with brands, status, and appearance. "Mom, can I get some Jordans for school? Everyone has them," he'd plead. knowing full well they cost more than our weekly grocery budget. When I gently explained our financial reality, his face would cloud with a frustration that felt increasingly personal. "Dad would get them for me," he'd mutter, not quite under his breath. And of course, Thomas would. The next weekend, Jackson would return home sporting the coveted sneakers along with a new designer hoodie and the latest iPhone. I bit my tongue to avoid saying anything negative about his father's indulgence. That was another rule in our post-divorce world. Never criticize the other parent, no matter how undermining their actions might be. Despite the growing divide in our lifestyles, I continued making sacrifices to ensure Jackson had every opportunity. I picked up extra administrative shifts to pay for SAT prep courses. I drove him to tennis lessons and debate tournaments in our aging Honda, while Thomas and Stephanie cheered from the sidelines in their matching luxury SUVs. I helped him research colleges, staying up late after long workdays to proofread essays and fill out financial aid forms. "You don't have to come to this tournament, Mom," 16-year-old Jackson told me once, shuffling his feet awkwardly in our kitchen. "Dad and Stephanie will be there, and there's not a lot of seating." The implication was clear, though I pretended not to understand it. "I wouldn't miss it, honey. I'll find a spot in the back." And I did. I sat in the last row of bleachers watching as Jackson excelled in the debate competition. Afterward, Thomas, Stephanie, and Jackson posed for photos that would appear on social media, their perfect family tableau. I stood off to the side, offering congratulations that felt increasingly superfluous. When college acceptances began arriving during Jackson's senior year, I was thrilled when he was admitted to his dream school, and then devastated to learn the financial reality. Even with scholarships and my modest savings, we were facing a significant shortfall. Before I could figure out a solution, Thomas swooped in. "We'll cover whatever the scholarships don't," he announced grandly at Jackson's graduation dinner. "Consider it taken care of." What Thomas didn't mention was that "we'll cover" meant mostly me. Our divorce agreement stipulated that we both contribute to college expenses with the percentage based on our respective incomes. With Thomas earning 5 times what I did, the lion's share should have been his. But somehow, in the public narrative, he and Stephanie became the generous benefactors, while my contribution, which represented years of careful saving and financial sacrifice, went unacknowledged. Jackson left for college with excitement and hardly a backward glance. I stood in his empty bedroom afterward, touching the posters he'd left behind, and wondered if this was how it would be from now on. Me, forever in the background of his evolving life. During his freshman year, our phone calls grew shorter and less frequent. When holiday breaks arrived, he spent most of his time at Thomas and Stephanie's house, where they hosted lavish parties for his new college friends. He would visit me dutifully, but these visits had the distinct feeling of obligation rather than desire. "You should see Dad and Stephanie's new place," he told me during one such visit, sprawled on our living room couch, scrolling through his phone. "They've got this amazing entertainment room now with a projector and everything, and Stephanie had it designed with space for all my stuff when I'm home from school." Home. The word stung. This small house with the faded furniture and walls covered in his childhood artwork had been home for the past decade, but now in his mind, home was shifting to the sleek, modern showplace Thomas and Stephanie had created. I noticed other changes, too. The way Jackson mentioned certain friends from good families, emphasizing their parents' professions and connections. The way he commented on my clothes or car with barely concealed embarrassment. The way he abbreviated visits with me if Thomas offered an alternative plan. "You understand, right, Mom? Dad got tickets to the playoff game. It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing." I always understood. I always stepped aside. I always said it was fine. But watching my son transform into someone who valued wealth and status over sincerity and sacrifice was anything but fine. Seeing him become embarrassed by the very things that represented my love for him, our modest home, home-cooked meals instead of restaurants, thoughtful gifts instead of extravagant ones, cut deeper than any pain I'd felt before. Thomas, Stephanie, and Jackson began to form what looked increasingly like a complete family unit. They took vacations together, posting perfectly filtered photos from beaches and ski resorts. They had inside jokes and shared experiences from which I was conspicuously absent. Even their golden retriever, a recent addition named Apollo, featured prominently in their family narrative. Still, I persisted in trying to maintain my place in Jackson's life. I sent care packages to his dorm. I learned about his classes and asked thoughtful questions. I remained available whenever he needed advice or support. I told myself that eventually, when he matured, he would recognize and appreciate the quiet, consistent love I had always provided. But as his college years progressed, that recognition seemed increasingly unlikely. The gap between us widened with each passing semester. My son was becoming a stranger, one who viewed me with a mixture of obligation and mild embarrassment, a young man who had learned to value the shiny and immediate over the steadfast and enduring. As Jackson's 25th birthday approached, I saw it as an opportunity to reconnect and perhaps remind him of our special bond. Despite our growing distance, surely a milestone birthday would bring us closer again. I began planning weeks in advance, determined to make it perfect. I reached out to Thomas and Stephanie first, wanting to coordinate rather than compete. I was thinking about Jackson's favorite childhood restaurant for his birthday dinner. I suggested during our awkward phone call, the Italian place downtown where we used to celebrate special occasions. "That's actually perfect," Stephanie replied with surprising enthusiasm. "We were just discussing venue options. Let's do it there." We discussed budget next. Though the restaurant wasn't expensive by Thomas's standards, it would stretch my finances considerably. Still, I didn't hesitate. "I can contribute $600 toward the dinner," I offered, mentally rearranging my monthly budget to accommodate the expense. "That's very generous, Nettie," Thomas said in that slightly condescending tone he'd developed since our divorce. "We'll handle the rest, of course, and we'll take care of sending out invitations." In the following weeks, I threw myself into preparations. I decided to bake Jackson's favorite cake myself, a triple chocolate layer cake with raspberry filling that had been his birthday request every year until he discovered Thomas and Stephanie's preference for professionally made designer desserts. The recipe had been passed down from my grandmother, and I'd made it for every one of Jackson's birthdays until he went to college. I spent hours gathering the ingredients, making sure everything was perfect. The day before the party, my kitchen became a workshop of love as I carefully measured, mixed, and baked. The familiar scent of chocolate filled my small house, bringing back memories of birthday candles and Jackson's gap-toothed smiles. For his gift, I chose something deeply meaningful, my father's vintage watch. It had been one of the few valuable items I'd kept after the divorce, a family heirloom that represented continuity and tradition. I had it professionally cleaned and restored, the aged leather strap replaced with new material that matched the original. I placed it in a small wooden box lined with velvet, along with a handwritten note expressing my love and pride in the man he'd become. The morning of the party, I spent extra time on my appearance. I wore a new dress I'd saved up for, styled my hair, and applied makeup carefully. Looking in the mirror, I saw glimpses of the younger woman I'd once been before years of putting everyone else first had dimmed my light. "Tonight will be different," I told my reflection. "Tonight, we reconnect." I loaded the cake carefully into my car along with the gift box and a card. The drive to the restaurant was filled with anticipation. I arrived early, wanting to help with any last-minute arrangements. The first warning sign came when I entered the restaurant. The hostess directed me to the private room we'd reserved, but instead of being welcomed as a co-host, I was immediately handed a stack of place cards by one of Stephanie's friends. "Oh, good, you're here. Could you set these out while we finish the balloon arch?" the woman asked, not bothering to introduce herself. I nodded and took the cards, noticing that they were professionally printed, nothing like the simple design I'd suggested when discussing plans with Thomas. As I began arranging them on the tables, I scanned for my own name. It wasn't on the head table where Jackson would sit. It wasn't at the table with Thomas's parents. In fact, I couldn't find it at all. "Excuse me," I asked Stephanie's friend. "I don't see my place card." She glanced up from the balloon arch, looking slightly embarrassed. "Oh, I think they just added you to table 5 in the back, since you're helping with serving the cake and everything." Table 5? The farthest from the head table, tucked in a corner near the kitchen doors. I swallowed hard and continued setting out the cards, including one labeled Apollo at the head table, right next to Stephanie's place. The family dog had a seat at the main table. I did not. The restaurant filled quickly with guests: Jackson's college friends, Thomas's colleagues, Stephanie's extensive social circle. Thomas and Stephanie made a grand entrance 30 minutes after the scheduled start time, carrying elaborately wrapped packages and calling out greetings to everyone. Jackson arrived shortly after, looking handsome and grown up in a tailored suit that I suspected Thomas had purchased for the occasion. I made my way through the crowd to greet my son, the cake box carefully balanced in my hands. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said, rising on tiptoes to kiss his cheek. Jackson gave me a quick, distracted hug. "Thanks for coming, Mom. Is that the cake? You can put it on the dessert table for now." As I placed my homemade creation beside the impressive array of catered appetizers, I couldn't help noticing how simple it looked in comparison. Still, I took pride in knowing that every ingredient had been selected with love, every layer an embodiment of years of birthday traditions. When dinner was about to be served, I looked around for my assigned seat. Table 5 was indeed in the far corner, filled with distant acquaintances, and a couple of Jackson's former classmates whom I barely knew. As I hesitated, wondering if there had been some mistake, I saw Jackson gesturing toward the head table. Apollo, the golden retriever, sat in a special elevated chair, a custom dog bowl placed before him on the table. Stephanie was adjusting a birthday hat on his head, while Thomas took photos. The scene was surreal, the dog treated as an honored family member, while I stood holding my purse, uncertain where I belonged. I approached Jackson, trying to keep my voice light. "I don't seem to have a seat at the main table. Is there room for me there?" Jackson glanced up, his expression a mixture of impatience and embarrassment. "Come on, Mom," he said loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You always liked staying in the background. You're just back where you belong." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stood frozen, aware of curious glances from nearby guests, feeling the heat of humiliation rise in my cheeks. At that moment, I saw myself through my son's eyes. The unimportant ex-wife, the boring mother, someone to be accommodated rather than celebrated. I retreated to table 5 without another word. Throughout dinner, I watched as Thomas and Stephanie dominated the event. They toasted Jackson with expensive champagne. They shared amusing anecdotes about his childhood, stories that often excluded me entirely or rewrote history to diminish my role. They took credit for his accomplishments, from his academic success to his recent promotion. "We always knew you were destined for greatness," Thomas announced, raising his glass. "It's in your DNA." When it came time to serve the cake, I rose automatically to help. For years, I had been the one to carry in the birthday cake, singing louder than anyone. But before I could reach the dessert table, Stephanie was already there, directing the waitstaff to bring out not my homemade creation, but an elaborate multi-tiered cake from an upscale bakery. "We thought we'd save your cake for later, Nettie," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This one matches the decor better." I nodded and returned to my seat, watching as they presented the professional cake to applause and cheers. My cake, made with hours of effort and years of tradition, sat forgotten in its simple box. The final blow came during Jackson's thank you speech. He stood at the head table, champagne in hand, looking confident and poised. He thanked Thomas for teaching him ambition and drive. He thanked Stephanie for showing him the importance of social connections and presentation. He thanked Thomas's parents for their wisdom. He even thanked Apollo for loyal companionship. I waited for my mention, for some acknowledgement of the mother who had raised him, who had been there for every fever and nightmare, who had built her life around his needs and dreams. It never came. As the speech concluded to enthusiastic applause, I sat in the corner holding a plate with a slice of the bakery cake I hadn't touched, feeling more invisible than I ever had before. Years of pushing my own needs aside, of accepting second place in my son's life, of quietly supporting from the shadows. It had led to this moment of complete erasure. And in that moment of crushing clarity, something inside me finally broke. But in breaking it, also began to heal. As laughter and conversation swirled around me, I sat absolutely still, experiencing what felt like an awakening. Every sacrifice, every moment of putting myself last, every time I'd accepted disrespect to keep the peace, all of it played through my mind like a movie I was seeing for the first time. My mother's voice echoed in my memory. "Never make yourself small for others, Nettie. The right people will love you as you are." I had forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way, surrendering my sense of self-worth, so gradually I hadn't noticed its disappearance. I thought about the young woman with the sketchbook full of dreams and quiet confidence. What would she think of me now? What would she say about how I'd allowed myself to be treated, not just by Thomas and Stephanie, that was almost expected, but by Jackson, the person for whom I'd given everything. The realization hit me with stunning clarity. Love shouldn't require erasure. Motherhood shouldn't mean martyrdom. By accepting treatment that diminished me, I had taught Jackson that I was in fact diminishable. I placed my napkin beside my untouched cake and stood up. No one noticed as I walked to the coat room and retrieved my purse. Inside was the small wooden box containing my father's watch and the note I'd written. I held it for a moment, feeling its weight in my hands. The original note had been full of effusive love, almost apologetic in its eagerness to please. I took it out now and turned it over, writing a new message on the blank side with the pen from my purse. Jackson, true love comes with respect. When you're ready to see me as a whole person, not just a convenient background character in your life, I'll be waiting. But I won't be waiting in the shadows anymore. Love, Mom. I walked back into the party with a strange sense of calm. The nervous, people-pleasing woman who had arrived hours earlier was gone. In her place was someone older and wiser, someone who had finally reached her limit. I approached the head table directly. Thomas noticed me first, his eyes widening slightly at whatever he saw in my expression. Stephanie paused mid-sentence, her hand moving automatically to adjust her perfect hair. Jackson turned, last, his smile fading as he registered my presence. Without a word, I placed the small box in front of him. Our eyes met, and for a moment I saw confusion replace his usual casual dismissal. I didn't explain. I didn't create a scene. I simply turned and walked toward the exit. "Nettie, wait!" Thomas called, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. He started to rise from his seat. I paused, but didn't turn around. "No, Thomas, I've waited long enough." And with that, I walked out of the restaurant and into the cool evening air, feeling both lighter and stronger than I had in years. The drive home from the restaurant was surreal. Tears blurred my vision occasionally, but they weren't tears of despair. They felt more like release, like rain washing away years of accumulated dust and revealing something valuable underneath. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment looking at the modest house I'd made into a home. For years, I'd felt apologetic about it. The aging paint, the small yard, the simple furnishings that couldn't compete with Thomas and Stephanie's showcase home. Now, I saw it differently. This house represented independence, survival, a place that was truly mine. Inside, I kicked off my shoes and changed out of my carefully chosen dress. I made a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table waiting for the inevitable phone calls. My cell phone rang multiple times, Jackson, Thomas, even Stephanie. I let them all go to voicemail. Whatever crisis my departure had created, it could wait until morning. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out my old sketchbook and a set of watercolors. As midnight approached and passed, I painted, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. By the time exhaustion finally overtook me, I had created a self-portrait. Not of the young woman I had once been, but of the woman I was now, with lines of experience around my eyes and a newfound determination in my expression. The next day, my friend Lisa called. She had been at the party, seated at another distant table, and had witnessed my exit. "Everyone's talking about what happened after you left," she said without preamble. According to Lisa, Jackson had opened the box almost immediately after my departure. The vintage watch had drawn admiration from the guests, but it was the note that had silenced the room. Jackson had read it, his face changing visibly. He'd excused himself shortly after disappearing into the restaurant's bathroom for nearly 20 minutes. When he returned, the party's atmosphere had shifted. Thomas had attempted to recover the celebratory mood, but Jackson had remained subdued for the remainder of the evening. He'd left early, declining offers from friends to continue the celebration at a nearby bar. "And here's the kicker," Lisa said. "He took your homemade cake with him when he left. The fancy one got left behind." Over the next few days, Jackson called repeatedly. I listened to his voicemails, but wasn't ready to speak with him yet. I needed time to figure out who I was beyond being his mother, or Thomas's ex-wife. For the first time in decades, I was putting myself first, and it felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I enrolled in an art class at the community center, something I'd wanted to do for years but had always found reasons to postpone. I reconnected with old friends I'd let drift away during my marriage and its aftermath. I consulted with a financial advisor about my retirement plans taking control of my future in a way I'd previously thought impossible. I even began planning the trip to Italy, a dream I'd deferred since college. It would require careful saving, but for once, I was determined to prioritize my own wishes. I started a dedicated savings account and named it Nettie's Renaissance. 2 weeks after the birthday party, Jackson showed up at my door unannounced. He looked tired and uncertain, nothing like the confident young man who had dismissed me so casually at the restaurant. "Can we talk?" he asked, standing on my porch in the late afternoon light. I invited him in and offered tea. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table where I'd helped him with homework, bandaged scraped knees, and listened to countless stories about school and friends. The familiarity of the setting contrasted sharply with the unfamiliar tension between us. "I've been trying to call you," he began, his voice smaller than I remembered. "I know. I needed some time. Mom, about what happened at the party." He hesitated, struggling with words that had never come easily to him. "I was a jerk. No worse than a jerk, I was cruel." I didn't contradict him or rush to absolve him as I might have done before. I simply waited. "The thing is," he continued, "I didn't even realize I was doing it. Treating you like you were less important. It's been so gradual, and Dad and Stephanie are so flashy," I supplied. "Impressive, status conscious." He nodded. "Yeah, all of that. And I guess I started seeing things through their lens. What looks good, what impresses people, who matters in terms of connections and influence." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that reminded me painfully of the little boy he'd once been. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what actually matters. It was the beginning of a long, difficult conversation. We talked about the years following the divorce, about how Thomas and Stephanie had created a narrative that gradually diminished my role in his life. We talked about materialism and appearances versus substance and sincerity. We talked about respect and gratitude. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I'm so sorry, Mom, for the party, but also for all the times before that when I made you feel like you weren't enough." His apology was sincere, but I knew that one conversation wouldn't heal everything. "I accept your apology," I told him. "But moving forward, our relationship needs to change. I need to be respected as a whole person, not just accommodated as your mother." We established new boundaries that day. I made it clear that I wouldn't tolerate being treated as an afterthought regardless of Thomas and Stephanie's influence. Jackson agreed to regular one-on-one dinners without his father or stepmother's involvement. Most importantly, I expressed my need to pursue my own interests and development, even if that sometimes meant I wasn't immediately available when he wanted me to be. It wasn't an overnight transformation. There were missteps and old patterns that tried to reassert themselves. But slowly, our relationship began to heal on a new foundation of mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. 6 months later, Jackson invited me to dinner at his apartment. He had recently moved out of Thomas and Stephanie's pool house into his own place, a modest step toward independence that I quietly celebrated. When I arrived, I was surprised to find he had prepared a meal himself, including a somewhat lopsided but earnest attempt at my chocolate raspberry cake. "I wanted to make something special," he explained, slightly embarrassed by the cake's appearance. "I found Grandma's recipe in that old cookbook you gave me." As we ate dinner, I noticed a familiar object on his bookshelf. My father's vintage watch displayed prominently alongside photographs from his childhood. Many of the photos included me pictures I hadn't seen in years that must have been stored away in albums I'd given him. When my birthday came around the following spring, Jackson organized a small celebration at my favorite local restaurant. The guest list included my friends, not just his or Thomas's connections. The reservation was in my name, and I was seated at the center of the table, not relegated to the periphery. Thomas and Stephanie weren't invited. When I asked Jackson about this, he shrugged. "This is about you, Mom, not about family politics or keeping up appearances." That night, surrounded by people who truly saw me, I realized how far we had both come. Jackson was learning to see beyond the values Thomas and Stephanie had instilled in him, and I was learning that it's never too late to become the protagonist of your own life story. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt and backsliding. There had been uncomfortable confrontations with Thomas and passive-aggressive messages from Stephanie. There had been well-meaning friends who suggested I should let it go for Jackson's sake, but I had held firm to my newfound sense of self-worth. And in doing so, I had not only reclaimed my place in my own life, but had also taught my son an invaluable lesson that love without respect isn't really love at all. That true strength sometimes means walking away, and that it's never too late to rewrite your own story. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you love to teach them how to truly see you? I found that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is prioritize our own worth even when others have forgotten it. Share your story in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more journeys of self-discovery and healing. Remember, it's never too late to become the main character in your own life story. Thank you for listening, and I wish you the courage to stand in your truth, no matter how difficult that might be.